All right, so here we are. We're going to do a little bit of bantering before the show starts. Happy 2021, everybody. Thanks for joining us here. It's been a while since we've gone live, not for a Patreon show. So nice to see everybody joining us. Mark, good to see you as well.
Good to see you, Dan. Happy New Year. New year, new me, right? 2020 vision is gone and now it's 2021, which is just going to be so much better, right?
I hope so.
I, I,
Yeah, well,
I'm trying to be serious here.
yeah, I'm, you said New Year, New You. It is a New Year, same us, but I actually moved and I'm in a new apartment and I've got this beautiful wall of Spidey art here behind me. That's going to be my new backdrop. I'm hoping to kind of do a video about all those different pieces back there, but I thought that was kind of fun. So yeah, this is going to be a good time today. We're doing a best comic of the decade for this episode. We'll get started in just a minute here, but we thought it'd be fun to just bop in and say hi to everybody. Mark, any news about your backdrop that's exciting? You still at the bar?
I have hung up some new stuff on, behind me in the cellar here. Nothing that's probably overly visible from my camera. I'm like trying to bop my head around to like show anything, but nothing's coming up. But I mean, that wonderful art that you sent out to our Patreon listeners, that is now up on the wall, and it's very exciting. Especially love that Juggernaut piece.
Yeah, mine. You can see mine. It's like right over here. There it is, right there. That awesome Juggernaut
Yeah,
piece. Well, great. Well, hello everybody. Thanks for joining us, and we're gonna get this show on a roll. Happy 2021, and we hope you enjoy what we've put together today. So, Mark, you ready to
should
get
be
started?
fun. Let's do it. Let's start the arguing.
Okay, here we
not
go.
not not with each other. Not with each other. I think others with us.
So we'll see. We'll see. Okay, here
Yeah.
we go. Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavoston, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which I say definitely count. And I think in 2021 we're going to have to wait and see because we haven't had an annual yet this year, and I think that track record is going to remain pretty solid.
Right? I mean, nothing says counting like calling yourself an annual and not releasing annually. But, I digress because I am indeed the mischievous. That's how I'm gonna start 2021 by pronouncing it correctly, apparently. Mischievous Mark Chinacchio, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, but the annuals don't count. The Amazing Spider-Man indexes count, and Dan, well, I did not purchase every single one. I purchased 6 of the 7 giant-size Spider-Mans recently. So I'm going to say at least those 6 count because I don't think you have those, right?
Well, Mark, I think I don't have those. I do have the giant-sized man thing and Spider-Man comic, which is
Right,
I guess is
right.
one of those. But I do want to say this. 2020, an unusual year to put it at the least, but also a year in which we saw 2 annuals for in a year. So, Mark, maybe that was the prophecy of doom was what
Right.
we flew too close to the sun with these annuals, and it has just sparked a cosmic retribution in the form of COVID-19. So there you
I,
go.
I would, you know, yes, I will say that is why we had a pandemic. All because of the annuals. Anyway, let's continue with the show.
Yeah, too much of a good thing. Well, hey, everybody, welcome to 2021, and thank you for joining us for this special episode of The Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider Man comic universe.
Yeah, and if you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app. We got so many of them listed up there. I don't even know some of those had podcasts, but they do, and they have ours. So do it there.
There's even more that have than this, but check out on iTunes, prominently Spotify. All these places are a great place to tune into our show. And we're here live on YouTube because every other week we put out a mainline episode of our flagship show, and sprinkled in between we review new comics. Although 2020 was a lot more of the new comics than the seasonal stuff. But don't worry, we're going to get back on track shortly. It's season 5. And we've also done a lot of interviews with some of the greatest Spider-Man creators of yesterday and today. So if you haven't listened to all of those, go back and check them out. But today we're doing something a little bit different. As it's a new year and a new start for this show, today marks the perfect time to start listening. Mark, what are we going to be doing today?
Yeah, Dan, in today's episode, to celebrate the new year and, depending on your opinion on the matter of the new decade, Dan and I are going to be looking back on the past decade of Spider-Man comics to choose what we think are the best single issues of Spider-Man during that time. We'll have a brief discussion of how we approach this challenge and then go over our individual picks. If you have opinions about our picks or our methodology, we'd love to hear from you at amazingspidertalk@gmail.com. Also, if you have any single comics that you think are the best of the decade, let us know. We would love to hear how wrong we are.
Yeah, and if you're on YouTube, don't forget to hang around after the show where Mark and I will be taking your questions before we move on to our Patreon exclusive discussion of Amazing Spider-Man Volume 5, number 54.LR and number 55, the so-called end of the Last Remains arc, which is not really that. But it should be fun to talk about it with you, Mark, either way. But to the topic at hand, today we're here to crown a comic, a single issue, the best comic of the decade. And Mark, I think we have to say this because some people are going to call us out and say, wait a minute, didn't the new decade start at the start of 2020? And we're doing this now not because 2020 is a lost year that we all never want to think about again, but we are decade truthers. So Mark, what do we mean by this?
But let's be real here. There is no year zero. So what's the 10-year period? I mean, it's 01 to 0. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You know what I mean? So that's you could say that we're wrong, but we're not wrong. That's how it works. It never started at year 0. The first decade was AD 1 to 10. All right. So that's what we're doing. 2011 to 2020 is the period from which we have selected these issues from. Because that's the decade, damn it. I say it. I so say.
And I agree with you. And because no one is here to argue with us about it, it is now truth and the law of the land. And I also thought, it's a new year. That's kind of a good time to look back. But also, Mark, this year marks, the 8th year that we've been doing this podcast, if you can believe it. And not that 8 is a special number in any significant way, but I thought it's almost a decade, and we've covered a lot of the books that we're going to be talking about tonight in extreme detail on our show over the years, and also because I noticed that the start of Big Time was exactly 10 years ago in January, so it's kind of an interesting line of demarcation in terms of kind of choosing a comic to define this era as we're kind of concluding what's called the first half of Spencer's run and all of Dan Slott's time as a solo person on the title. So kind of an interesting parameters for a discussion like this. Although I will say we're going to cover all comics, not just Amazing Spider-Man proper. When we considered this, we were thinking about everything. Although I think our answers kind of lean a little more heavily just towards ASM proper. So there's that. Absolutely.
Do you want to talk about, I guess, some of the parameters that we set in terms of what we considered it the best comic? I mean, I think if I could start with one of my parameters, I mean, obviously there are some great Spider-Man stories from the past 10 years, but even if the comics we ultimately selected, kind of semi-spoiler alert, did kind of feed into larger arcs, I feel that the fact that these function so well as kind of a singular comic That played a big role, and frankly, like that kind of winnows the list down substantially when you consider how a lot of comics are written today, like Last Rights, maybe, or Last Remains. Sorry, LR, whatever LR stands for. I keep forgetting.
Yeah, no, it's really funny because looking back through this, and I literally went on like my Marvel Unlimited and set the parameters for the past decade, every book that Spider-Man appeared in, and just went through my list, and highlighted the ones that stood out to me. And I'll talk about some runner-ups, see whether you agree, ones that you considered as well for the list. But for me, it became very apparent that so many stories are now told in these mega arcs. We really don't get a lot of those single issue or 2 issue stories anymore. But there is still, I think, a fine art to the kind of like, not done in one, but like creating a significant chapter that kind of stands on its own. I think you and I have kind of been good about highlighting this over the years, if only through the format of our podcast, which takes things, literally sequentially, right? We don't do the big mega arc reviews unless it's like a B title or something that we want to highlight in some way, like Life Story or something like that. So like there were really good stories like Life Story that I would have considered for this, but there was no one issue of Life Story to me that really stands out in my mind. They were all certainly quite good, but to me that story is better as a whole than it is individually.
Absolutely. So, I mean, beyond that kind of procedural parameter, I mean, the other thing, I mean, like, hey, we're talking about it. These are opinions. These are instinctive opinions here. But like, I think in both of our choices, we're kind of putting value on a story that does something kind of different and unique and kind of stands out on its own for how it approached a Spider-Man story. Is that a fair statement versus something there? Maybe it was a really well done story, but it was also a story that has been done in a similar vein before over the annals of history of Spider-Man.
Is there a book in particular that stands out to you? That you're like, this would be a great one to consider, but it's just too familiar for me to really include as someone that stands on it. Stands out to you as the best of the decade.
I think immediately, and frankly, in terms of things that I considered that were not from ASM, I would say that Spectacular, it's 310, right?
Yeah.
The Chip Zdarsky, the one that won the Eisner. Because, like, I mean, great story, great comic, lovely comic. I wish the whole run that Chip Zdarsky did was written in that tone, because I felt his overly jokey style, frankly, did not work in that book. Whereas that book was such a standout, and it kind of made me say, where the hell was this guy writing stories like this whole time? But at the same token, like, it was kind of like this. It was the let's appreciate who Spider-Man is kind of story, which we've had before so many times over the course. I mean, Paul Jenkins basically made a living out of it when he was writing Peter Parker Spider-Man, and I love those stories, and they're probably some of my favorite stories. So seeing Chip Zdarsky do Paul Jenkins, while I enjoyed it, it didn't, to me, I couldn't call it a best of when it feels so familiar in terms of the tone and the theme of it.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, not to mention that Tom Taylor did a very similar story in Friendly Neighborhood just like a month or two prior, with another kind of kid who collects or sick child storyline. That's not to reduce Zdarsky's book. But you're right. That's a very good issue, but it didn't quite make the top of our list. What about
frankly, I was going to say, frankly, not to interrupt you, but frankly, a few months later, Dan Slott then did it with 801. You know what I mean? But like, I felt like that had a different kind of tone, only because it felt more like, while it was a Spidey appreciation story, it was also kind of Dan Slott reflecting on his own time with the character. So like, there's a part of me that actually prefers Dan Slott's to Chip Zdarsky's, but neither one of those is our best up pick. So let's just be clear here.
Yeah, well, I mean, that story really kind of brings up another interesting angle that this could be approached from, which is the kind of like metatextual commentary and the kind of place in history. I think about Amazing Spider-Man 700, which I will admit was my original pick for this, and then rereading it today, I changed my choice because while I love that story, and I think it's probably the most fun I've had reading a Spider-Man comic in the past decade, just by the pure nature of I needed to get to the comic book store like on Christmas Day. I think it was released on like Christmas Eve or whatever. I had to get there. Like nothing was going to stop me. And every page turn of that book was like just nail biting anxiety. It was so fun. Like I've never been more invested in Spidey comics. But rereading it, it did feel like, it was really relying on the time and place. I don't feel like it really used all of the comics medium as an art form to its maximum potential in the way that I feel like My Choice does. So like that was one that I think time has still held up as great, but it didn't maintain the emotions that I invested in it the first time that I read it. I think actually Amazing Spider-Man 800, I find a more emotionally raw book today than 700, even though at the time 700 was a book I liked a lot more. So, just kind of other things to consider is like divorcing it from the day it released. Was that something you considered?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's funny. Like when you texted me this suggestion, let's do this, I think I immediately gave you My Choice, which, I think to me speaks volumes about, I mean, like, I absolutely could have gone back and reread 5 or 6 other issues that I was considering and like kind of like, but like the fact is like when I think of, let's be clear. We're talking best here, and by best we need like I'm talking like the narrative structure, the art, how it all works, how it's all executed. But the same token, like I'm a historian at heart, Dan. So like I want to like like the reason part of what stood out to me about my comic was it just felt like in terms of impact on the character and the universe, like it just had it was such a gut punch in terms of how me reading it for the first time and being like, holy crap, this is really happening. You know what I mean? And like I feel like there's been so few comics over the years that upon first read gave me that kind of just visceral reaction to it. And I feel like 700 did, but 700 was more about you already kind of knew what was going to happen at the end of 7 because Superior had already been solicited. We knew it was coming out like a week later.
Yeah.
And we knew that that Superior was going to be Doc Ock. So it was like, all right, we know Spider-Man's going to lose or Peter Parker's going to lose somehow. It's the anxiety of going through page by page and like how is he going to lose? And like that made it riveting, but like that kind of whereas the book I picked, it was like this felt so shocking to me at the time. And like for that, I think it's just, that's where it's brilliant. Like never has a comic shocked me quite so viscerally before.
Well, you're knocking on the door of revealing what book it is you chose. I do want to, just before we get to that really quickly, I do want to kind of seize upon this idea of influence. I think, influence is really important. And I think the book I chose does have a substantial influence on where the book would go for a while, even to today, I would argue, and I'll make that argument. But it wasn't everything for me. Like influence wasn't the major contributor. So like I could say like Spider-Man #1, which I really loved. Not Spider-Man 2 #1, which I really didn't love. But if we do a worst of the decade list, you might see Spider-Man 2. But Spider-Man #1, probably the most... maybe one of the most influential comics of the decade, right? I mean, like this whole universe crossing over thing has become almost a key component of Spider-Man mythos at this point, much to my chagrin, even though I love Into the Spider-Verse above all others. That it's not an element of the character that I think is a key component, but that book, whether intending to or not, really kind of unlocked that door. For that kind of thing. But it's not my favorite book of the decade, nor do I think it's the best utilization of comics, in Spider-Man of the decade, but certainly really influential. So, there's other books like that, I think about, that didn't make my choice because of that just because of that reason. So, anyway, that's the
Right,
last
right.
point I wanted to make in terms of my consideration. So, Mark, all this being said, we are knocking on the door of revealing our
We're
choices.
tap
So,
dancing here, right?
yeah, maybe that's the better metaphor. So, Mark, why don't you stop tap dancing as much as I enjoy it and tell us what is your Amazing Spider-Man single issue comic of the decade?
Well, I ended up going with Amazing Spider-Man 698, which, of course, is the prelude to the Dying Wish arc, but I think totally functions by itself as a standalone issue. I mean, yes, you of course want to know what the hell happens next when you get to the end of it. But like, if this was just a comic that you handed somebody and said, okay, this is a Spider-Man comic, what do you think? I think that they would be completely flabbergasted by what happened here. I mean, then of course this is Dan Slott and it's Rich Elson, right? Who's not even like a big time artist on the book, but like the artwork is very functional and fits the story well. The whole thing is paced, I think, very very well. I mean, like what I always found so disarming and wonderful about this comic is it kind of starts off as this, it's like that day in the life of Spider-Man comic. I mean, again, kind of like what I was talking about with Chip Zdarsky and Dan Slott and Paul Jenkins, like let's appreciate what makes Spider-Man Spider-Man. And he's like, I feel so free swinging from building to building, and oh look, there's MJ, and as you're reading it, you do get a sense like this doesn't totally sound like Peter's inner monologue here. Like there's like almost like too much navel gazing going on, which is, I mean, Peter is notoriously very much in his head. But there was just something a little different about it that, of course, is the red flag galore. And in the background, is the fact that Spider-Man's longtime nemesis Doc Ock, who you see on the cover there. He is in the final hours of his life. His disease-ridden body, which has been brutalized by Spider-Man over the years, is dying. He had his last gambit with Ends of the Earth, which is not one of the more memorable stories of the last decade. So Spider-Man gets called to the raft to visit Doc Ock on his deathbed with the Avengers. And again, like the interactions with the Avengers, there's just something a little weird about it. And of course, like the big reveal, and for anyone who was in a cave for the duration of 2012 to 2013, is that Spider-Man is actually Otto Octavius, and inside Doc Ock's dying body is Peter Parker. And like that reveal to this day, like, because it's, Doc Ock keeps saying Peter Parker, like croaking it out, and you're like, and everyone of course is like, why is he saying Peter Parker? And what he's actually saying is, I'm Peter Parker. And it's just such a brilliant reveal to what would then be the next year and a half of insanity on this book, right? I mean, like this sets up the entire Superior era. This is basically like the Superior Spider-Man pilot issue, right?
Yeah.
And like, say what you will about this era, we are not shy to the fact that we hold it very fondly. We think that these were great comics. I know people disagree with that, and to each their own, but like, to set the way, this is the perfect setup for that. Like there is like, it's, to me, it's the most creative and inventive and masterfully executed like double fake that we've ever gotten in a Spider-Man comic. I mean, for every crappy Goblin reveal we've ever gotten, this is the best. This blows up, like this just goes to show, take off the stocking cap and the Goblin face, and you can actually do a reveal right in Spider-Man comics. And also don't tease it for 50 issues, so there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I love this issue. I'm curious to unpack this really quickly in two different ways, which is um, like I love all the little elements of this book. I mean, the art is really, I think, noteworthy in how unnoteworthy it is. It feels
Yes.
very classic. It feels like an inventory story, and
Hmm.
and kind of forgettable, and everything is rosy. Although Peter, there's something a little more stern and serious about him than normal. His kind of highlighting his powers and over highlighting them kind of like goes back to like the Stan Lee, Jerry Conway eras of how a Spider-Man book was written. Um, and wasn't too much of a divergence from how Dan Slott had been writing it. Um, but it's just enough that you're like, I remember reading this the first time and thinking, this is a really forgettable comic. Can this really be what this comic is? Just like a really boilerplate Spider-Man issue? But all of those choices are deliberate. And, and I think people have criticized Dan Slott for how he writes Peter Parker, people including us, right? Like that he never really got Peter Parker's voice. Um, but I think in many ways, this issue is, like you said, the pilot for Superior, but it's kind of a case in point of what Dan Slott was getting at, is that there really is only such a like fine level of difference between Peter Parker and Otto Octavius at points in their lives, and that you can detect it, but it isn't obvious, is kind of case in point for the all of Superior.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, but like at the end of the day, you also, I mean, again, we could say what you want to say about how Dan Slott wrote Peter, but like even even knowing that, like you knew that there was still just something not quite right there to know that after the reveal is made that it all makes sense how it wasn't Peter the whole time. You know what I mean? Like he clearly got Peter enough to know how to write not Peter. You know, like if that makes sense. Like and I always feel like that was the tightrope that Dan Slott walked so masterfully during the duration of Superior. Was like, yes, there were similarities, but where they diverged was distinct and had enough of its own voice where it would work. Like there was never a point during Superior where I was like, I felt like even when Otto started to become more of a hero, where I felt that he was becoming Peter, because he never was, like that there was always just enough distinction and differentiation there where you knew that this guy just wasn't enough, didn't have enough of the soul of Peter to be able to truly be Peter. And this book just like proves that point from Jump Street. Like it just something felt kind of, again, soulless is the word I kind of come to. I mean, you mentioned sternness, but like there's lacking like an emotional level there. Like there's like an emotional distance to the character, that for all the times that Dan kind of wrote Peter a little juvenile, whatever. Like there was still kind of a soul to the character, that I think rang true to who Peter was.
This is also one of the rare books that, like, the minute you end it, you want to reread it again. So it gives you
Hmm.
that double joy of, it's almost like a double length comic without actually being. They should put that on the cover. Only 21 pages, but
Right.
double the length. But
They should have released it as one of those flip book comics, but it just would have been the same comic both times, just the other time upside down, and you know what I mean,
yeah,
like one of those
absolutely.
'90s style flip books.
I mean, it's kind of one of those things that, like, as much flack as we might have given Dan Slott over the years for various issues, like, this is why you read Dan Slott comics, is because, like, every once in a while he'll just do something completely out there and blow you away. I'm thinking about like his like infinite time loop story from the Silver Surfer run, or even more recently the thing Alicia Masters honeymoon issue with Fantastic Four. There's just he'll do something that just does a home run, and makes his books really memorable. And as much as I have been off and on enjoying Nick Spencer's run. I considered his issue one for this list. It's not my choice, but I don't think he has any stories that are quite nearly as memorable in his first 2 years as any of the stories in the first 2 years that Dan Slott did. Like he would just, you might not have liked them all, but when you liked it, it was a grand slam.
Yeah, and again, not to make this like a Slott versus Spencer thing, but like, the other thing to note here is like how this in 698 you have this story which, like you said, kind of starts off like, what is this, an inventory book? You know what I mean? Like what's going on here? And then when you get to the end and you actually, realize what just happened, like it is it is a very full story that's not like overly decompressed or anything. You know what I mean? Like it's perfectly paced. It gets, there's a clear beginning, middle, and end, and then P.S. There's two more chapters after that. But like you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of story here. Like it ends up being a lot more story than you realize on first blush when you know what happens at the end. And like this is not just for Nick Spencer, but I think for a lot of writers in comics, like in terms of how to pace and work out a story that that has to pay off even further. Like they should take note of something like this. Like I think a lot of writers struggle with pacing. I think like the decompressed storytelling mode that Bendis made so famous has really taken ugly grasp of comics lately, and like
Yeah.
something like this is refreshing about how uncompressed it is. You know what I mean? It's just it's like I don't know. It's just
I think that's what made
anyway.
the Superior era so notable is like for a lot of its run. I think especially for the first half of its run, it was kind of like one and done check-ins on the world of this Superior Spider-Man that would get upgraded slowly. But it wasn't until like halfway through when you get these longer story arcs. I think once they realized that it was a hit, and I actually think it got worse once it started doing that. I think you and I have well documented that that like around the time of Wacker's descent, the book was not quite the
Yeah.
same, or
Yeah,
not
the
descent. Yeah,
2099 run is probably where it started to shake off a little bit, I would say. Would you agree with that?
yeah, I agree with that. So let me ask you one more question before we move on. Is I remember
Hmm.
reading Chasing Amazing blog at the time that this book came out, and this is before you and I
Okay.
ever did this podcast, right? And
Yeah.
I think
Hmm.
you were kind to this book then, but I do remember issue 700. You wrote this piece, and I know that you hate me referring to this piece. That you were kind of like done, right? Like you were like, this is it. I'm not like this is the end of my collection, which I think you quickly righted when you came to your senses a little bit and read issue one of Superior or whatever, and realized it would still be a book about Peter Parker. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I do remember reading
Right,
that.
right.
And but now to see you list this as the best of the decade, I'm curious what your journey with this book has been, over time.
Right. Well, I mean, again, and this is where it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier in terms of like legacy and impact and things like that. I think, yeah, I mean, I think we're allowed to evolve and change as people, and like that's, nothing, I think it says less about someone if they just kind of hold firm to a point of view, even if it's clear that they're being a little pig-headed about it. But, at the time, I think that I was just kind of frustrated by because again you look at the context and it's just like it felt like here we go again. It's like it's the 90s all over again. Like it's not just Spider-Man, but there are other characters that they were um, doing away with. I mean, they had just done away with Ultimate Peter Parker, what, like a year earlier, you know what I mean? Like it just felt exhausting. I think that was kind of, and whenever I go back to when I stopped collecting in the 90s, it was during the peak of the Clone Saga, and what I always like to say is I just felt exhausted buying and reading Spider-Man comics because it just wasn't fun anymore. I just felt like I was trying to keep up with whatever the next gimmick was. Um, so probably what changed with me was kind of the realization that this wasn't a gimmick, like this was clearly meant to tell a larger story about Peter, about Otto, about other superheroes and the structure of superhero stories. And once I read more and more Superior and saw that this wasn't just like a cheap shock value gimmick. I think it really hardened my appreciation for what Slott did, both overall, but also with this specific comic. Does that make sense? Is that a good defense of my journey, I guess? Or
Yeah, well, I mean, you used to write the gimmick or good column over at CBR, so I could see you kind of keeping a spotlight on that.
right,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true, right? Like sometimes these things are just done for shock value, and it's hard to trust them. And I think there's an inherent cynicism built in, right? Like this week we got spoilers for issue 55. We got the like supposed death of Mary Jane, and I don't buy it for a second.
right,
You know what I mean? Like, and I
right.
could get all angry about it or upset, although, my feelings on that are probably more complicated than most people's. But you're right. Sometimes it takes a minute to see if it is just a gimmick or if there really is some substance there. So that's cool. Yeah. I mean, like I'm not knocking you for changing your mind. I think that's actually really cool. And I think why it makes it worthwhile to look back on the decade like this now that we're so far removed from it.
Yeah, definitely. So, Dan, why don't we take a quick quick little interlude here? Or sorry, I don't mean to, I'm jumping the script here.
Yeah, let's do it. Great pick, Mark. Amazing Spider-Man 698 is one of my favorites and certainly could have been my pick if you hadn't chosen it. So, yes, but if you want to hash out some of these discussions with us, why don't you come check us out in the Slack? Right, that's right. If you find this show entertaining and valuable, please come and check out our Spider Slack where the conversation continues. There is a link in the description to this episode, whether you're on YouTube or on iTunes, that'll lead you to our Spider Slack community where we just talk about Spider-Man all day. It's like an online forum of all of our fans. And honestly, my favorite place on the internet to talk about Spider-Man comics and everything. So come check us out in the Slack if you get a chance. And we'd love to see you there. All right, Mark, back to it. We are going to
Back to it.
We're going to talk about my pick. So I know I just went off script there. We're going to talk about my. Edit that out there, Rick.
Selfish 101.
Yeah, right. We're going to talk about my pick now for Best of the Decade. And my pick for Best of the Decade is, drum roll please, Amazing Spider-Man number 656. If that doesn't immediately jump out at you, this is part 2 of the No One Dies storyline. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait, 655 is like the really notable one from the No One Dies storyline. Why did you choose?
I believe I texted you this afternoon saying, wait, 656 or 655, Dan?
I know. I mean, and it's not even got Spider-Man in his red and blues on the cover. Why 656 instead of 655? Well, let me just say this. I think 655 is one of the best comics of the decade. And, we even did an Essentials episode on this storyline. If you really want to hear us get into real detail about both parts of it. But for me, 655 is really kind of a eulogy of an issue. There's, and a kind of an exposure of Spider-Man's mindset, which is certainly something that defined Dan Slott's run on the book. He was really a lot about, exploring, Spider-Man's mental state, even getting really extreme into it in Superior, as we, talked about. But for me, 656 is like a really solid Spider-Man adventure story that carries over the kind of emotional weight of 655, is informed by it, and gives the book a place to go with it. But within it's just a really elegantly done story that you could read on its own, that has an arc for the character and multiple characters within it. Some really beautiful dynamic action. I mean, we can't lie. When we read Spider-Man comics, it's fun to see him beat up some guys or do big dramatic things. And also, as much as 655, I think, is the more innovative visual comic, right? It does things with like swirling into Peter's memories and silence and stuff like that. It's really like a paragon of comic book making and what comic books can do as a storytelling device that other mediums can't do. I think 656 takes that same kind of ethos and applies it and artistic mentality that Dan Slott would revisit in 801 with Marcos Martin. But I think it applies it to a classically told Spider-Man story. And in many ways, I think it is probably one of the most elegantly told classic type Spider-Man stories that exist. So if you don't remember, in this story, Spider-Man has lost his spider sense and is called to address the villain Massacre, this kind of serial killer, or I guess terrorist character he's basically a gun-toting madman, and his signature trait is that he is unfeeling. He had a bit of glass fall through his head, pierce his brain, and now he has no empathy or sympathy for anyone. And so he stands as kind of a stark counter to Spider-Man as this very emotive, empathetic superhero. And, in the wake of Marla Jameson's death, Spider-Man has declared that he will not let anyone else suffer at the hands of his villains like she did. And he is going to, in many ways, supersede the police and stop this lunatic, if you will. And so that's kind of the story. And by the end, Spider-Man has invented a new costume, which I think is one of the more odd-looking Spider-Man costumes. The cover, I think, of this issue is really goofy, but I think the way the costume is presented in the issue is actually really cool. Like, it's very Batman, but there is something kind of creepy Spider-Man about it. And so it's a lot. It does that thing that I love about old Spider-Man comics, which is kind of obsessing over the minutia of how his powers work. We get a kind of cool thing here that says, like, he can't swing around the city comfortably anymore because his spider sense is gone. His spider tracers don't work because his spider sense is gone. And this new suit it's too heavy to swing from. So even though it's bulletproof, he's got to manipulate it in a different way. And that feels uniquely Spider-Man-y to me. And there's barely any Spider-Man in this issue. It is very much about Peter Parker and the people in his life and how he's handling it. He goes back to Horizon Labs and listens to his friends discuss how they would handle this. It's just a classic Spider-Man tale with this incredible level of artistry over it. Big, splashy letters that fill up the pages and create dynamic layouts. To me, this is like the height of... I think we all know that Marcus Martin is probably one of the best artists to ever work on Spider-Man, even if he didn't really get a run. And to me, this is like part of that oeuvre, is iconic images page to page, the rain pouring down on people, blood splashing, Spider-Man bold and standing on a rooftop, and this really touching dynamic ending where he throws himself in front of the bullets as Jameson, losing his mind in a blinded fury, orders the cops to fire on this man and potentially risk the innocent civilians. And Spider-Man again risks his life to save this very killer, proclaiming that no one would die, not even the bad guy. And to me, that's like the height of like who Spider-Man is. And speaking of influence, would go on to be something that I've actually gotten really sick of, which is exploring this no-kill code in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man. But to me, if you do it like this, I'm okay with it. So that's my reasoning why 656. I wonder, Mark, would you have chosen 655? Does this issue stand out for you?
I think you actually kind of sold me more on this one rather than, like, yes, I think on first blush I would be like, well, 655, of course. But, like, again, like, 655 is, in a lot of ways, it's kind of like the new 21st century version of, the floating heads of guilt for Spider-Man story, which we've gotten before. I mean, we've gotten it before, like, there's just no way around it. And what I'm about to say might sound like I'm contradicting myself, but part of the brilliance of 656 is it's probably the most Lee Ditko story that Dan Slott has ever written for
Mm-hmm.
Spider-Man, in that it's like kind of amplified for the modern era, but like it's very Lee Ditko, like that those first, I mean, not even just the first 38 issues, but like especially like those first like 10 issues where we're still kind of learning who Spider-Man is. And it's like you said, like the obsession with the minutia of how the, because now that we take the spider sense away, it's almost like he's completely learning how to be Spider-Man again without this one thing at his disposal. And I think that's important, like that kind of focus on Peter figuring it out and how to be Spider-Man. But then there's, like the new villain of the month, and it's like, he goes in there the first time completely unprepared, gets shot in the side, which to me is still one of the most shocking panels I've ever seen in a
Yeah.
Spider-Man book. Like I still like the second you brought this comic up, I like immediately thought, I think of two things. I think of Spider-Man falling off, while web slinging because the webbing doesn't stick properly to the bricks. And then I think of him getting shot. Like those are always the two things that stand out to me about this issue, because like they were both at the time just so like, oh my goodness, like like I never thought I'd be seeing something like that in a Spider-Man book, because the spider sense is just something you take for granted that things like that won't happen. Um, so you have, you know, Peter being completely unprepared the first time around, and then having to like go back to the drawing board. Like, think about like his fights with Sandman and Electro, those first few times, like the Vulture. There's always like that learning curve for the character, and it's like, okay, I need to be smarter, I need to be savvier. I can go in with armor, but like you say, that's going to slow me down, blah, blah, blah. So like it's like watching Peter kind of um, use his brain to overcome a situation. It's not just about his grit or his resolve, which are great points, but like, I like that those early books focus so much on Peter's wit and his intelligence, and this captures that perfectly. And then, like you said, I mean, there's the no one dies mantra, but like, you know, I think deeper that like this just feels so classic yet with a new twist. So that's why like I do think this was a really good choice in that regard. Like I don't think we've really gotten many books quite like this over the last 10 years. Like this is the biggest throwback yet not quite throwback that we've ever gotten before.
Well, when I was looking over the books, like I said earlier, so many of them are long story arcs, and the ones that I was drawn to, I guess the most fondly are things like even like that Time Door two-parter, right? Where
Yeah.
Peter had to get through the door that saw to the future, or The Rage of the Rhino, which I love. That's 2010, so it couldn't be included on the list. But, and I think that's what draws me back to Brand New Day so much, is just the kind of like one or two issues and then moving on. That really defined the Lee Ditko and like Conway stuff, with check-ins on Peter's life predominantly. And that's what this issue feels like to me. And, when you and I feel hot or cold on Spider-Man, I think a lot of it is me responding to books not being written like this. If every two issues I got a new idea in a Spider-Man comic of him fighting a villain of the week that reflected on Peter in some way, I think that would be my ideal version of reading a Spider-Man comic, rather than big 6-issue arcs. I say that, allowing some exception, like Coming Home is probably one of my favorite Spider-Man stories, and it's 6-issue arc. But I think that's the exception. I think really Spider-Man works better when the villain is not the main focus. It's about Peter, and the villain is some reflection of him in some way. Like I even look back at like
Mm-hmm.
Lee Ditko stuff, and it's like, look, Otto Octavius was cool when Lee Ditko, worked on that character, but you didn't want to spend all that much time with him. He was just a cool adversary for Spider-Man in some way. I miss the era of the kind of 1 and 2 done story arcs. And yes, this is part 2 of an arc, but I really think you could read it on its own with very little context, and it would stand as its own story. As a really strong, part of the Spider-Man mythos. So, did you reread this before we kind of, did the show?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like it was it's such a fun read to like even go back and do, and like talk about chasing amazing again. I was actually pretty cranky about this comic when I first read it. Not because I didn't enjoy the comic, but like again, like the spider sense element. I was like, is this just another, I guess I really was focused on gimmicks in 2012 because I was like, this just feels like another gimmick. What are we really trying to approve without this spider sense? It's just another challenge. But again, like, in retrospect, it was well done, and I feel like we really got a sense of it was commentary on Peter and how's he gonna get out of this one kind of a thing, you know what I mean? Which is like you said, you go back to those Lee Ditko issues, and that's what it was. And yeah, you didn't necessarily want to spend time with the villains in terms of them as people, but like they were cool enough to want to like be checking in, and like they were also a commentary on Peter and Spider-Man in some way. Electro and Doc Ock. I mean, Vulture. All of these guys are, like the inversion of power and responsibility, and in this case with Massacre, it's wait, Massacre.
Massacre.
Uh, okay, I'm trying not to confuse it with the other Goblin that we got in Brand New Day.
Menace.
Menace. Sorry, I make that mistake a lot, Dan, which I know might get my Spider fan card revoked. But point being, with Massacre, it's in telling the story of No One Dies, it was the perfect villain to introduce at this time. I mean, like, you know, I always feel like I have to like preface things about compliments about Dan Slott because of just how polarizing he can be in some of the less favorable places to talk about Spider-Man on the internet. Not the Slack necessarily, but the fact of the matter is, like, he really had, when he was on point, he really had a knack of just like all the strings just came together in the right way, and like this is a perfect example of that. Like, it's like he wanted to tell the story about Spider-Man and his responsibility to the point that like now no one was going to die. So who does he have to face off against in his first like trial in that era, but literally like a villain who, just like you say, has no ability to feel whatsoever and will kill indiscriminately. And like, how is he gonna survive that, especially with his current power set? So it's just a brilliant little twist of storytelling that makes everything click perfectly.
And I just want to just shout out one more time Marcos Martin and his artwork on this book, which I think is so stunning. And to make me love this comic, or not this comic, this costume, that final image of Spider-Man standing on the roof in the rain is iconic, even if it's more of a Batman image than it is a Spider-Man image. But when I think about this book, I just think about him standing there sullen on that rooftop, and it's really powerful. So I just wanted to give him a shout out for his artistry, which is really dominant here. So yeah, those are our picks: Amazing Spider-Man 698 and Amazing Spider-Man 656. I thought this was a lot of fun. I'm sure people will agree and disagree with our hopefully well articulated takes, but I hope in 10 years, Mark, you and I can do this again.
Absolutely, I hope so too. Well, yeah, we'll be able to, but hopefully the choices will be both difficult but meaningful, like the way Z's were.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this was tough. I mean, how do you judge one over the other? So anybody who's like, I disagree with you guys, it's like, well, look, there's a dozen other ones we could have chosen, and if we didn't say yours, trust us, it was probably on the list. But yeah, this was fun, Mark. I'm eager to do this again. But yeah, if you guys found this show entertaining and valuable, please consider supporting us. You can recommend Amazing Spider-Man to a friend, and if you're able, become a member on our Patreon.
Yeah, we can only bring you this content with the support of our Patreon members, and we owe the show's success to every single one of them. We're constantly making exclusive content for our members. For example, this week, Patreon members will hear Dan and me talk about Amazing Spider-Man number 54.LR and 55. the conclusion, more or less, maybe possibly, of the Last Remains arc. Last Remains, not Last Rites. I got to remember that.
That will be important for the review.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no doubt.
So if you enjoyed these conversations, why not take that $3.99 and put it towards a month subscription to support the show and start receiving our Patreon content? And when a new Spider-Man comic comes out, you'll hear our Patreon exclusive review of the podcast every new issue of Amazing Spider-Man the very same week that it comes out.
And if you contribute $10 or more a month, you gain access to exclusive artwork from famous Spider-Man artists commissioned exclusively for our members. Plus, every episode, we release a new episode-specific desktop background created for us by the fantastic artist Nick Cagnetti.
But we know it's a hard time for everybody, as it is for us too. So we appreciate anyone who supports the show just by listening, sharing the podcast with friends, and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts. But if you have the means, please join our Patreon to support the continued existence of our show. Just follow the link in the description. And again, a thank you to all the members who already make this show possible. It's only thanks to you that Mark and I can continue to do this.
But alas, Dan, it is that time for all the good things to come to an end, including the end of the decade by our parameters.
Yes.
So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this special episode of The Amazing Spider Talk.
As always, this episode was edited by Rick Coast with production support from Andy Myers. Our artwork comes handcrafted by artists Ron Friend, Sal Buscema, Ray Sumser, and Nick Cagnetti. Our theme songs were produced by Ryland Bojack and Spider-Madge, plus our introduction animation and musical stinger comes from Josh Sutton from the YouTube show Panels to Pixels. And if you're tuning in live, don't forget, as soon as the show ends, the conversation continues with our audience on YouTube. And if you missed out on Amazing Spider Talk Live this time, we'll be back soon on YouTube. So go there and subscribe and click on the bell to stay on top of all the new live recordings that we'll be doing in the future. But as always, this will remain a podcast first and foremost. That will always remain consistent, just like how we end the show. That's with our motto. So Mark, until 2031, when Spider-Man comics are printed at home with 3D printers in our living room, what's our motto?
I want to live in that future. Our motto, of course, is with great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.
And that's it. That's the end of the show, everybody. Now, hey, everybody watching live, we've got people watching on Facebook, YouTube, Periscope, and Twitch. But we're only reading comments on YouTube right now. So if you have questions you want us to talk about, head on over there, subscribe, and leave a comment. And Mark and I are going to answer one or two questions before we move to our Patreon page. So if you are a Patreon subscriber or you want to join us for our reviews of Amazing Spider-Man 54.lr and 55, go sign up for Patreon or go and find that YouTube link over there on our Patreon page. So we're going to give you some time to do that. In the meantime, Mark and I are going to answer some of your questions. So here we go. Here's one, Mark. Alex asks us, thoughts on the maybe upcoming Morbius movie. Do you have any thoughts about this, Mark?
I mean, they're not kind thoughts. I mean, look, all of these like Sony Spider adjacent movies. I got to admit, I still have not seen the Venom movie.
Oh, really?
Shame on me, right? No, I haven't seen it. It just felt wrong to me. Like, how do you do Venom without Spider-Man? I just you don't. That's the point. Like, so why are we doing this? Can I even stream it anywhere right now? Do I have to pay
I
money
think it's
for
on
it?
HBO. I think it's on HBO, but I'm not entirely
All right,
sure.
I have to check that out. Anyway, so no, I got to admit, Morbius, even prior to the Sony Spider-Verse or anything like that, like Morbius is just not a character that moves the needle for me, nor is like Silver Sable, which I know is like the other character they're always talking about putting in a movie.
Yeah.
I don't care, and I have no faith in the studio producing it. So, Won't see it. Maybe Dan, if you make me for the show, I'll see it.
Yeah, well, I will see anything in a movie theater after this is all over. So,
That's true.
let's make that a caveat. But yeah, I do, it doesn't look terribly promising to me. I don't really know like what there is about Morbius as a character without Spider-Man that really sets him apart from any kind of other vampiric character. Maybe that will get the superhero treatment, which is something we haven't really seen. I guess there was like I Dracula or whatever, which was kind of superhero-y, I guess.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I have like a morbid curiosity, if you will, pardon the pun, to check this out. I mean, especially now that it seems that we're getting a Spider-Verse movie, in the MCU. I imagine that like this is going to tie into that somehow based on that trailer. So I'm kind of curious how Marvel and Sony are going to like circle that square or whatever. But I'm not terribly excited for it on its own merits, but I'm willing to be surprised. Right. I enjoyed Venom for the kind of like complete bonkers show that it was. I mean, taking away from that it made like as much money as it did, I think they're going to take the wrong lessons from Venom, which was not a very good movie. And I think people liked in spite of itself. So we'll see. Not that thrilled about it, but I hope you are. And if you enjoy it, more power to you. Mark Springwell74 asks his standard question, which is, what's your beer tonight?
I have it is from Other Half Brewery here in Brooklyn, or I shouldn't say here in Brooklyn. I'm not in Brooklyn anymore, but close to here. It is a Strata forward double IPA called More Strata Than All Strata. So Strata is, for you beer nerds out there, it is the hop that kind of tastes a little bit like strawberry and berry notes. So it's a kind of a hoppy, berry forward IPA.
Well, there you go. So you guys go pick. What was the name of it again?
It's called More Strata Than All Strata from Other Half.
People are asking us, what do we think about One More Day being reversed potentially, and what are our opinions on Amazing Spider-Man 55? Well, you'll just have to go on the Patreon to find out our thoughts about that. Mark, were there any kind of runners-up that I didn't mention for your list that you kind of feel like you wanted to give a shout out to?
I'm thinking now because I think, well, I don't think it's on your written list, but I don't think we read this aloud. But Superior Spider-Man #9, which was like the Mindscape battle between Peter and Otto, which was, I think it was the first time we both went like full Monty on a comic on this podcast. Like we both really loved that at the time. I think the I wouldn't call it the penultimate, but I guess technically the final chapter of Spider Island in 673, like before the prologue issue. I would say that one was something that we considered for sure. Trying to think of something a little deeper cut that at least was on my short list. I mean, again, I landed on 698 pretty quickly. So
Yeah.
I didn't maybe give it a ton of thought because I just knew that was like my book right away. But in retrospect, a lot of the choices that you kind of brandied about, I definitely agreed should be in the running for sure.
Probably the most random one that I put on my list was Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows Volume 2, Number 4. Do you even know what that book is?
I don't remember that one, Dan. Which is that the one with the scorpion or something, or which one was that?
No, that's a Jerry Conway written one with Ryan Stegman art where the Spider family goes up against Mole Man. And they're kind of like captured underneath the earth in like a lava chamber. I just thought that book was the most beautiful evocation of like superhero family. that I had ever seen, and kind of had handled that adult Spider-Man really well. I mean, it's Jerry Conway writing it, and I thought that Ryan Stegman's artwork was really experimental and a step up. And I know that we interviewed him right around the time of that book's release, and he, expressed as much that he was trying new things. And for me, that was kind of the issue that signaled, as much as we loved his work on Superior, and I think he did an awesome job on like books like Superior 9 or Superior 3, another one I really liked, the Vulture Battle one. That was like really the birth of Ryan Stegman as an artist for me, was that particular issue of Renew Your Vows. It stood out to me. Not the book of the decade, but one that like really I thought was really interesting. All right. Well,
I just thought,
yeah.
Wait, hold on, Dan. I did think of one more, and I this might be a controversial one because it's not technically a Peter Parker Spider-Man comic.
Okay.
Can I throw it out there?
Yeah. That's open.
Edge of Spider-Verse #2, the debut of Spider-Gwen.
Wasn't that 4?
I think that was what. No, I think that was the second one.
Okay.
Will someone validate me in the comments?
Well, it's one of the two. So why that one? Because I definitely thought about that too.
Yeah, I mean, like, well, again, like in terms of like, I felt like it had a bit of hype going into it, but like I do feel like that was something that like lived up to the hype, had perfect execution, kind of really, to me, sold me on the Spider-Verse concept before the larger story actually unsold me. but at the time I was like, oh wow, I really want to like I'm really digging this concept, this idea that Gwen Stacy could have been a spider character, and like I felt like the way they told her origin story and unroll that in one issue was just so well done, and the art at the time just felt so edgy and different and in vibe with who the character was. I mean, like it's it's very rare that you saw it obviously with like Ditko in Spider-Man, where like the artist who is creating the character just seems so in sync with who the character is. Like it just doesn't happen, I think, from jump all that often. It's usually, it takes some time before the right artist gets paired off with the character, I think, to really send them off. But Robbie Rodriguez, say what you will about his dog and his F-bombs and everything else. It just was a well executed comic from start to finish. So.
And I will say, Mark, you are correct. It was 2, not 4. I think 3 Penny Parker and 4 the like Spider-Man cannibal guy. It's something like that.
Yes.
Yeah. That was a fun series.
Yeah.
Who'd have thought Penny Parker would go on to get the movie treatment? But those are fun comics too.
See, now I'm deep diving. I'd say another one would be Superior Foes #1. That was such a great issue. Anyway, we're totally digressing and going to make our other stuff late, so I apologize.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everybody for hanging out with us for all this time, and we'll see everybody who supports us on Patreon over on the Patreon show. So have a good night, everyone.
Good night, guys. See you on Patreon.
Too many who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to tangle. In 1962, last Wednesday's afternoon, they'll bend your ears with reckless self-abandon. The Amazing Spider-Man.